There is a cave system in the southeast of South Australia that has been sitting quietly under a sheep farming district for hundreds of thousands of years. Most Australians have never heard of it. The people who live near it, in the small town of Naracoorte in the southeast of South Australia, about 3 hours' drive from Adelaide, know it as a local attraction. A place you take visiting relatives on a Sunday afternoon. A national park with guided cave tours and a visitor center and a cafe. Something to do on a weekend. What those caves contain is one of the most significant fossil records on the planet. Not significant in the local sense. Not significant in the Australian sense. Significant in the sense that the findings produced at Naracoorte over the last 50 years have directly changed what scientists worldwide understand about the history of life on this continent, the causes of one of the most important extinction events of the last 100,000 years, and the relationship between human arrival in Australia and the disappearance of the enormous animals that defined this continent's ecology for millions of years before people got here. Those findings were recognized by the United Nations in 1994 when Naracoorte Caves was listed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, becoming part of the Australian Fossil Mammal Sites World Heritage Area alongside River Slay in Queensland. That listing placed Naracoorte in the same category of global scientific significance as the Galapagos Islands, the Grand Canyon, and the Serengeti. It remains almost unknown outside the small region that surrounds it. What the caves contain, and what scientists have found inside them, deserves a full account. If you are new here, this channel covers Australian history, science, and country that most people were never properly taught. Subscribe now and let me know in the comments below whether you had heard of Naracoorte Caves before watching this video today. Let us start with what the caves are and how they formed. Because the geology of Naracoorte is the reason everything else that happened there was possible. The Naracoorte Caves are formed in a sequence of ancient limestone that was deposited when this part of southern Australia lay beneath a shallow tropical sea approximately 500,000 to 800,000 years ago. Over time the sea retreated, the limestone was exposed at the surface, and rainwater, made slightly acidic by absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and soil, began to dissolve the limestone along fractures and bedding planes in the rock. This process, which geologists call karstification, created the cave system over hundreds of thousands of years. Water moving through fractures in the limestone dissolved the rock grain by grain, widening the passages slowly, creating chambers of increasing size, and eventually forming the network of connected spaces that exists beneath the Naracoorte landscape today. The specific geography of the Naracoorte region contributed to what made the caves a trap of extraordinary effectiveness. The landscape above the caves is gently rolling agricultural country. It does not look dramatic, but scattered across it, mostly invisible to anyone who is not looking specifically for them, are shallow depressions in the surface where the limestone roof of a cave chamber has collapsed or where a shaft connects the surface to the cave system below. These openings, some of them narrow enough to be concealed by grass and leaf litter, functioned for hundreds of thousands of years as pitfall traps for any animal that fell into them. The animals that fell in could not get out. The bones of those animals accumulated on the cave floors. Layer by layer, over hundreds of thousands of years, the remains of every animal that was unlucky enough to fall into one of those shafts built up in the caves below. Preserved by the stable temperature and humidity of the cave environment. Protected from the weathering and scattering that destroys bones on the surface. Covered by successive layers of sediment washed in by water and blown in by wind through the cave openings. The Naracoorte Caves are a natural fossil trap of extraordinary duration and completeness. The sediments on the floors of the fossil-bearing chambers at Naracoorte contain bones spanning the last 500,000 years of Australian animal life. A continuous record, layer by layer, of what was living in this part of the continent at every point across that half-million-year span. No other site in Australia, and very few sites anywhere in the world, has produced a fossil record of comparable completeness across a comparable time period. Now let us talk about what that record contains. Because this is where the findings become extraordinary. The fossil record of the Naracoorte Caves is dominated by the remains of the Australian megafauna. The giant animals that inhabited this continent during the Pleistocene epoch, the period from roughly 2.5 million years ago to around 10,000 years ago, when conditions globally were characterized by repeated cycles of glaciation and warming. The megafauna of Australia were extraordinary by any standard. Diprotodon optatum was the largest marsupial that ever lived. A wombat-shaped herbivore the size of a modern rhinoceros, weighing up to 2.5 tons, browsing the vegetation of the Australian interior in herds that must have shaped the landscape around them as significantly as elephants shaped the African savanna today. Procoptodon goliath was a giant short-faced kangaroo standing nearly 2 meters tall, with forward-facing eyes that gave it binocular vision unlike any modern kangaroo, and with hands capable of pulling down branches to feed from trees that ordinary kangaroos could not reach. Thylacoleo carnifex was the marsupial lion. Not a lion in any taxonomic sense but a large predatory marsupial whose bite force, calculated from the proportions of its skull and jaw muscles, was among the strongest of any land predator of its size in the fossil record. It had retractile claws on its hands and a specialized tooth configuration unlike any other known predator, living or extinct. Megalania prisca was a giant monitor lizard, related to the modern Komodo dragon but reaching estimated lengths of 5 to 7 meters and estimated weights of several hundred kilograms. The largest lizard known to have existed on land anywhere in the world. Genyornis newtoni was a giant flightless bird, related to modern ducks and geese but standing approximately 2 meters tall and weighing over 200 kilograms. An enormous herbivorous bird that would have been a significant presence in any landscape it inhabited. All of these animals, and dozens of others at smaller scales, are represented in the fossil record at Naracoorte. Their bones are in the sediments of the fossil chambers in quantities and qualities that have allowed researchers to study them in detail unavailable from any other Australian site. Complete skulls. Associated skeletal elements. Bones from individuals of different ages that allow life history and population structure to be reconstructed. Bones from different layers of the sediment sequence that allow changes in species presence and abundance to be tracked through time. The Naracoorte fossil record does not just tell researchers what animals were here. It tells them when each species was present, in what relative abundance, and when each species disappeared from the record. That temporal information is the most important thing the caves have produced. Because the question of when the Australian megafauna went extinct, and why, is one of the most significant and most contested questions in the entire history of Australian science. Let us talk about the extinction. The Australian megafauna did not survive to the present. The continent that Europeans encountered when they arrived in 1788 had kangaroos and wombats and possums and emus, but it did not have Diprotodon. It did not have Thylacoleo. It did not have Procoptodon or Genyornis or Megalania. These animals were gone. The question that has occupied Australian paleontologists, archaeologists, and ecologists for decades is straightforward to state and extraordinarily difficult to answer. When did they disappear? And what? The why has two candidate explanations, and the debate between them has generated more scientific heat than almost any other question in Australian natural history. The first explanation is climate change. The Pleistocene was a period of repeated glacial cycles, each one reducing rainfall, shrinking forests, expanding deserts, and placing stress on animal populations that depended on vegetation resources that were becoming increasingly scarce. Under this explanation, the megafauna were already in decline from climate-driven habitat loss before humans arrived, and the final disappearance of each species reflects the cumulative pressure of repeated climate deteriorations rather than any single cause. The second explanation is human hunting. The first Australians arrived on the continent at least 65,000 years ago, possibly earlier. They brought with them hunting capability that the megafauna had never encountered and to which the animals had no behavioral adaptation. Under this explanation, even a modest level of hunting pressure on slow-reproducing large animals was sufficient to drive populations to collapse faster than they could recover, leading to the sequential extinction of species that had survived millions of years of climate variation before humans arrived. The debate between these explanations is not simply academic. It is a debate about human responsibility, about whether the first Australians were the agents of one of the most significant ecological transformations in the continent's history, about what the arrival of people, even people living in small mobile groups using stone tools, means for the animals that shared the landscape with them. The Naracoorte fossil record has been central to this debate because it provides the most detailed temporal record of megafauna presence and absence of any site in Australia. The sediment sequence at Naracoorte covers the period before, during, and after the proposed timing of both the climate deteriorations and human arrival, allowing researchers to ask directly which factor corresponds more closely to the pattern of extinction in the record. Research published in the early 2000s by a team led by Dr. Gavin Prideaux from Flinders University, Working with the Naracoorte fossil record in combination with dating of the sediment layers using uranium series and optically stimulated luminescence techniques, produced what remains one of the most important datasets in the megafauna extinction debate. The Naracoorte record shows that many megafauna species persisted through multiple cycles of climate deterioration across the last 300,000 years without going extinct. Species that the climate hypothesis would predict were vulnerable to habitat loss survived glacial cycles that produced conditions as severe as or more severe than the conditions that prevailed at the time of their eventual disappearance. This finding does not eliminate climate as a contributing factor, but it significantly weakens the argument that climate alone was sufficient to drive the extinctions. Animals that had survived 300,000 years of climate variation, including conditions comparable to those at the time of extinction, did not simply succumb to climate in the last glacial cycle unless something additional had changed. What changed, the Naracoorte record suggests when combined with the broader Australian archaeological and paleontological evidence, was the presence of people. The most detailed analysis of the Naracoorte temporal record places the disappearance of most megafauna species from the site within the period following the arrival of humans in southeastern Australia, a timing that is consistent with the human overkill hypothesis even though direct evidence of people hunting megafauna at Naracoorte itself has not been found. The absence of hunting evidence does not mean hunting did not occur. It means the conditions that preserved the bones of the prey did not preserve the evidence of the hunters. The pitfall trap mechanism that created the Naracoorte fossil record selected for animals that fell into cave shafts, not for the humans who may have been hunting them in the surrounding landscape. What the record does show is when the animals disappeared, and that timing is consistent with human arrival in a way that it is not consistent with climate change alone. This finding has not resolved the extinction debate. No single finding has. The debate continues among researchers who weight the available evidence differently and who interpret the incomplete record in different ways. But the Naracoorte contribution to that debate has been more substantial than that of any other single site in Australia, and the findings produced there have consistently pushed the scientific consensus in the direction of a significant human role in the extinctions. Now let us talk about what else the caves have produced. Because the megafauna are not the only significant finding from Naracoorte, the caves have also produced an exceptional record of smaller animals. Bats, rodents, reptiles, frogs, and small marsupials are all present in the fossil record alongside the megafauna, and their record tells a different story from the large animal record. Most of the small animal species present in the Naracoorte fossil record 500,000 years ago are still present in the surrounding landscape today. The small animals largely survived whatever eliminated the large ones. This pattern, large animals extinct and small animals persisting, is consistent with the human hunting hypothesis because hunting pressure falls most heavily on the largest and most reproductively slow species and least heavily on small, rapidly reproducing animals that can sustain losses at a higher rate. The small animal record also provides a detailed picture of how the ecology of this part of Australia changed as the megafauna disappeared. The species composition of small animal communities shifts across the sediment sequence in ways that reflect the changes in vegetation and habitat structure produced by the loss of the large herbivores that had been shaping the landscape before their extinction. When Diprotodon disappeared from the Naracoorte landscape, it did not simply leave a gap in the fossil record. It left a gap in the ecological role of a large browser that had been influencing vegetation structure, creating habitat for other species, and moving nutrients across the landscape for millions of years. The subsequent changes in small animal community composition at Naracoorte reflect the downstream ecological consequences of that loss, rippling through the ecosystem in ways that the detailed record of the caves has preserved and that researchers have only recently had the analytical tools to read. The Naracoorte Caves also contain something that most people who visit them on a Sunday afternoon tour do not know is there: living bats. Hundreds of thousands of them. The bat cave at Naracoorte is one of the most significant bat maternity colonies in Australia. Several species, most significantly the common bentwing bat, use the cave to give birth and raise their young during the summer breeding season. The cave maintains a temperature and humidity that is ideal for raising young bats, and the colony has been using it for this purpose for a very long time. The living bat colony and the fossil record beneath it exist in the same cave system. The bats that are raising their young in Bat Cave today are doing so in a space that has been accumulating the bones of animals for 500,000 years. The guano deposits from centuries of bat occupation have themselves become part of the sedimentary record of the cave, and the chemistry of those deposits carries information about what the bats were eating, and therefore what insects were present in the surrounding landscape at different points across the period of colonial occupation. The cave is alive and dead simultaneously. A fossil archive and a living ecosystem occupying the same space, the present and the deep past coexisting in a darkness most visitors never see. Now let us talk about what the research at Naracoorte has produced in the last decade specifically, because the most recent findings are the most surprising. The application of ancient DNA techniques to the Naracoorte fossil material has opened a window into the genetics of the megafauna that was previously unavailable. Extracting DNA from bones that are tens of thousands of years old, in sufficient quality to yield useful genetic information, requires exceptional preservation conditions. The stable temperature and humidity of the Naracoorte Caves have provided exactly those conditions for certain specimens, and researchers including teams from the Australian Centre for Ancient DNA at the University of Adelaide have successfully extracted ancient DNA from several species represented in the Naracoorte collection. The genetic data recovered from the Naracoorte megafauna specimens have produced findings about population structure, genetic diversity, and evolutionary relationships that were not available from the bones alone. The ancient DNA of Diprotodon, analyzed from Naracoorte specimens, has revealed aspects of the species' population history, including estimates of population size over time and evidence of population subdivision across the continent, that contribute to understanding how vulnerable the species was to the pressures it faced before its extinction. The ancient DNA research at Naracoorte is ongoing. Each year the techniques improve and the amount of genetic information extractable from ancient bones increases. The specimens in the Naracoorte collection, some of the best preserved megafauna material in Australia, are a resource for this research that has not yet been fully exploited. What the caves contain, in terms of both fossil material and its potential for future research, is not exhausted. The excavations in the fossil chambers have reached depths corresponding to the sediments deposited approximately 500,000 years ago, but the chambers extend deeper. What lies beneath the excavated levels, in sediments deposited before 500,000 years ago, has not been fully investigated. The fossil record from those deeper levels, if it is as well preserved as the material from the excavated levels, could extend the temporal range of the Naracoorte record significantly further into the past and provide a picture of the Australian fauna across a time period that is currently poorly documented at any Australian site. The caves are still being studied. New passages are still being explored. The full extent of the cave system has not been mapped. When you put all of this together, the picture that emerges is of a site that is carrying one of the most important scientific archives in the world in a limestone hill under a sheep farming district in the southeast of South Australia. A 500,000-year record of animal life in Australia. The most detailed temporal evidence available for the timing of the megafauna extinction. Ancient DNA from species that no longer exist anywhere on Earth. A living bat colony that is itself a biological record of the surrounding landscape across centuries of occupation. And chambers that extend deeper than the excavations have yet reached, containing material that future research techniques will eventually be able to read. The people of Naracoorte know they live near something remarkable. They have built a visitor center and a cafe and a guided tour experience that introduces thousands of visitors each year to at least the surface of what the caves contain. The surface is extraordinary enough. What the science has found beneath the surface, layer by layer through 500,000 years of accumulated darkness, has changed the understanding of this continent and of the animals that shaped it in ways that the Sunday afternoon tour does not fully convey. The caves are still there. The fossils are still in them. The bats are still raising their young in them every summer. And scientists with better tools than any previous generation are still finding out what those layers of darkness contain. If this changed how you think about Naracoorte and Australia's ancient past, leave a comment below and subscribe for more Australian history and science that most people were never properly taught.